I have lost my faith as as a liberal. I've lost my faith. I don't really believe in it. But in my gut, I still do.
Reset is about going back to the beginning, back to the book of Genesis, and looking at that ancient origin story to see if the ancient text can still speak today. On Reset, we are going back to the beginning today with Tom Holland. He is the author of many books, including Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. Tom Holland, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me back.
Hey, yeah, we had a little chat, I guess, about 3,500 years ago, or November, as it was known in the old money.
Yeah, pre-COVID. I mean, it seems a very, very long time ago.
Pre-COVID, but it was post the launch of the hardback edition of Dominion, and now the paperback has come out. And I wanted to begin by asking you about the paperback cover, which I absolutely love. But it's such an interesting compare and contrast, I think, to the American cover of your book. You know, if you're going to write a book about the influence of Christianity, one way of doing it would be the American way, and you show Salvador Dali's sort of crucifixion, and there is Christ, kind of, you know, everything else is in his shadow. Whereas this is going for a very different approach. What are you trying to communicate with this kind of collage?
The multiplicity of influences that Christianity's had, and the way in which that influence is expressed in trends and in developments that perhaps people might not automatically think of as being Christian. So you have feminism, you have the Beatles, you have Martin Luther King, as well as more obvious symbols of Christianity, cathedrals and angels and so on, and also that you've got hints of the classical world that both influenced the development of Christianity and which Christianity very radically transformed. So I guess the collage on the front of the paperback is suggesting that this is a long story. This is tracing a long story. Whereas the American cover, as you say, features Dali's famous painting of Christ on the cross, and I guess that's equally making the same point that this is where it all begins. This is the kind of ground zero of this immense earthquake, which you can trace out across time. But it's a kind of different emphasis, I guess.
Yeah. For those who haven't yet read the book, obviously they need to go out and grab the paperback now. But what is the thesis in a nutshell?
The thesis of the book essentially is that Christianity is the most transformative and revolutionary ideology that has ever existed, and that in its distinctively Western form, it continues to completely saturate the way that people in the West view the world, not just morally or ethically, but on issues as fundamental as how they, the things that they take for granted about how, say, sexuality operates, relations between men and women, how society is structured, the nature of progress, all kinds of things that people might be tempted to take for granted and just assume exist out there in the sky, but aren't at all. They're very culturally contingent, and they're very specifically bred of the deep roots that the West has in Christian history and theology.
Where do you find people most objecting to that thesis? Where do you find people most considering their views to be neutral or obvious or universal? Whereas I guess your argument is those things would be contingent on Christian history and how it's shaped us. But where do most people kind of trip up on this?
Well, one of the inspirations for writing this book was an event I did in the wake of a previous book called In the Shadow of the Sword, which was about the world of late antiquity, and had at its climax the emergence of Islam. And the argument of the book was essentially that the Muslim understanding of where Islam had come from was, in its canonical account, quite late. So in Christian terms, the earliest life that we have of Muhammad is essentially kind of 200 years after his lifetime. So in Christian terms, that would be equivalent to, say, the Gnostic Gospels, some of the Gnostic Gospels. And what do the Gnostic Gospels tell us about the lifetime of Jesus? Probably not very much. They tell us much more about what people, say, in around 200 AD thought. And so likewise, the argument of In the Shadow of the Sword was that the received accounts of Muhammad's life and how the Quran emerges tell us a lot about what Muslims thought in, say, the year 800, but very little probably about what was going on within the lifetime of Muhammad. And this was obviously, to lots of Muslims, quite a controversial and sometimes upsetting thesis. And I remember one Muslim at a talk I was giving saying, why have you done this? You'd never do this to your own beliefs, your own, if you think that they're myths, why are you not questioning your own myths? And I felt that was a very germane question. And the values and assumptions that I had were essentially those of the Enlightenment, of kind of liberal secular humanism. It never crossed my mind, for instance, in writing In the Shadow of the Sword, to think that God had actually spoken to Muhammad. And I wasn't being neutral in thinking that. That was the position of someone who's not a Muslim. So therefore, it's not a neutral position. And so in the wake of that, I did think, well, what are the beliefs that I hold dear? What are the values that I hold dear? What are the assumptions that I take for granted? And I thought, well, I'll try and trace them back as far as they will go. And it was already kind of clear to me that actually the Enlightenment myth, the idea that there'd been a period of light in ancient Greece and then darkness, and then the light switch had gone on again with the Enlightenment, was mythical, a restructuring, if you like. As it turned out, I think of Christian myths, of Christian ways of seeing the world. But one of the things that I wanted to set myself with Dominion was basically to look at almost everything that I took for granted and say, well, how far back can I trace it? And invariably, it went back not to the Enlightenment and generally not to ancient Greece, although Greek philosophy does indeed have a huge influence on Christian theology. But never, in the fundamentals, when I trace those threads back, they lead back to Christianity. And that was why I wanted to write the book. Just as when I wrote In the Shadow of the Sword, the most vituperative criticism came from Muslims who said, this isn't a myth, this is true. So with Dominion, the most vituperative criticism has tended to come from people who believe in the Enlightenment myth, the idea that it all begins, or humanists who believe that their values are just kind of immanent and not culturally contingent, or can be traced back, that they just exist everywhere. But I think that these are myths, and nobody likes having, people don't like to be told that their myths are mythical.
Yes. Well, I mean, speaking from a
I found it unsettling as well.
Sure.
So I have sympathy.
So had you been mostly brought up and formed with the sort of the Edward Gibbon myth that basically...
Yeah. I'm sure I told you this before, but I was kind of brought up in the Church of England and went to Sunday school and so on, but was always more emotionally and indeed to a degree spiritually engaged by the gods of Greece. And by the glamour and the potency and the charisma of Greece and Rome. And I did feel that, when I shut my eyes and I thought about Greece, I would see blue skies, or think of Imperial Rome in its heyday, I would see blue skies. And then when I thought of the coming of Christianity, Constantine's conversion or whatever, it would be autumn. It would be drizzle, it would be rain, and that's kind of very synesthetic response that was kind of an emotional one, essentially, rooted in things that were not kind of necessarily intellectually grounded. But I did find when I read Gibbon kind of 15, 16. That it provided absolutely the kind of intellectual cladding for what was this gut impulse that you know, the grey breath of the Galilean had turned the glamour and the charisma of the classical world to ash. And yes, that was very much the kind of gut instinct I had.
Yes. Which itself is, I guess, an inheritance of the way that Christianity has shaped us. There's sort of a darkness and a light kind of moment, and in Edward Gibbon's telling of things, there is the vanquishing of an evil by the dawning of a light and that sort of stuff. But I guess would you say that itself is testimony to how deeply the Christian myth has kind of worked its way into us?
I think Gibbon himself is. I mean, he was raised Protestant. He famously converted to Catholicism, then turned back to Protestantism, and then became a kind of Enlightenment sage. But I think always remained in his gut a Protestant. And I think that the Enlightenment is a kind of recalibration of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, that's why I don't think it's anything spectacularly new. And everything that Gibbon is doing in questioning the church, in kind of mocking it as a source of superstition and idolatry, is what the Protestant reformers were doing to the Roman Church, to the Catholic Church. And that attitude towards idolatry and superstition is, of course, one that Christian missionaries in the early Middle Ages are bringing when they go into the dripping woods of Saxony, and Boniface chops down the tree that is sacred to Thunor, in the way that Protestant reformers kind of overthrow statues of the Virgin, or Gibbon sneers at the stories of the saints written by Jerome. There is a kind of continuum there, and of course, ultimately, it goes back before Christianity to the Hebrew prophets and to the legacy of Isaiah or Jeremiah, who are absolutely talking about bringing people who walk in darkness into light, and who are dismissing the idols of Babylon or Egypt as mere stock and stone. And that is the great continuum that has run from the Jews, from the Babylonian exile, through the Jews of the pre-Christian period, into Christianity, through the Reformation, into the Enlightenment, into the present. So when Richard Dawkins is often called evangelical, and he's preaching good news. He's preaching good news that that light has come, that if you let the light into your heart, into your mind, then you will be purged of superstition and idolatry, that you will be elevated to a new understanding of the way that the cosmos functions. And this is again a very kind of culturally contingent thing to be preaching. I mean, why where does this impulse to condemn superstition and proclaim the coming of light, where does it originate? It's not a given. It's something that is bred of the culture in which Richard Dawkins has emerged.
Okay, so to steelman Richard Dawkins, he comes back and he says, well, obviously Christianity had a role to play in the banishment of superstition and in establishing Enlightenment values and in establishing a scientific method that wants to investigate the world and overturn superstition. But that's just one voice among a whole chorus of voices. What's so special about Christianity?
Because it's a very, very distinctive way of understanding the world, and one of the things that is so intriguing about Western liberalism, Western secularism, Western humanism is that it has inherited from Christianity and, to a sense, transmuted the conviction that what it teaches is properly universal. So this is something that you don't get, say, in classical Indian cultures. You don't get it in China. This desire to propagate a particular way of seeing the world and spread it around the world so that everyone comes to share in it. And essentially what happened over the course of the imperial heyday of the West, which is now coming to an end, is that there were certain areas of the world where people could be conquered and their gods could be banished and their civilizations could be effectively either wiped out or so transmuted as to be unrecognizable. And their Christianity was planted unapologetically. So that's the case in North America, in South America, in Australia, in New Zealand. But there were other regions of the world where European Christians went, and they found themselves confronted by civilizations that in many ways were vastly more sophisticated and ancient than their own. So India or China or Japan. And the way that Christians there exported their values was to pretend that, or indeed to assume that concepts that were absolutely bred of Christian theology, Christian history, like the notion of the secular, like the concept of human rights, could somehow be divorced from the culture that had bred them, and were just kind of manifest. Everybody had them, and this was incredibly effective. So there's an Indian scholar I quote in the book who says that Christianization proceeds in two ways: through conversion, which is obvious, and through secularization, which is much less obvious. India was not converted to Christianity, but it was converted to secularism. That's why when the British leave, the Indian Republic is defined as a secular republic. Likewise, say in Turkey, Ataturk rejects Islam. He doesn't think that he's converting to Christianity, but he does basically convert to secularism. And as a token of that, he transforms the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, that had been the great monument of Orthodox Christianity, had been converted into a mosque with the conquest of Constantinople. Ataturk converts this mosque into a museum, a neutral space. Now, I think that the conceit of the West has always been to assume, well, this is just the natural order of things. You know, all around the world, this is the way. It's kind of like the life cycle of a butterfly. Caterpillars become butterflies. Superstitious, backward people who worship gods become secularists. This happens everywhere. But we are seeing now that is a complete delusion. That this is a very, very culturally contingent assumption. And we see this summer where in India, Modi has gone to Ayodhya, the city that supposedly was the birthplace of Rama, the great hero of the Ramayana, and which many Hindus have come to believe the Mughals deliberately built a mosque on the site, which led radical Hindus in the 90s to destroy that mosque. Modi went this summer to lay the foundation stone of a great temple which will be built to Rama on the site. And essentially it's a statement that India is not a secular state preeminently, in Modi's opinion. It's a state that should properly be defined by this vast inheritance of Hindu scripture and tradition and practice and ritual, the kind of totality of Hinduness, if you want. That Hinduism is not a religion in the way that the Protestant missionaries and administrators who'd come with the British in the 18th century had assumed. That to be Hindu is properly it's not to practice a religion, it's to be Indian. That's essentially the kind of core assumption of Modi. And this is something that is obviously deeply threatening to the secular foundations of the Indian Republic, and a reminder that the English language and cricket weren't the only legacies that the British left behind, that have endured and persisted after the era of the Raj. And likewise with in Istanbul, President Erdogan's reconsecration of the Museum of Hagia Sophia as the Mosque of Hagia Sophia is a very, very blatant statement that the era of the secular is over in Turkey. That this was not a kind of, the secular in Turkey is not something neutral. It's an expression of an alien and I would argue specifically Christian way of seeing the world that gives all the more potency to the reconsecration of this great building that had once been a cathedral to Islam.
Yes. Yeah. So that is the waning of the Christian revolution in terms of geopolitics, in terms of India and in terms of Turkey. Where do you see the influence of Christianity waning here? Because I guess there's two ways of seeing some of the convulsions that are happening in the West. One is to see them as, in a sense, hyper-Christian, hyper-Protestant convulsions of the same revolution, and another way of seeing it is it's the waning of Christian influence on the West. Which is it?
Yeah, well, I think that the person who really did get this right was Nietzsche, and Nietzsche said, posed this question: can you have Christian values without Christian belief? And he also said, kind of riffing on Plato, that God is dead, but his corpse continues to send shadows on the walls of the cave, so it looks as though he's alive. Yes. And I think that the state of the West at the moment is, I mean, we're so Christian that almost everything we do remains kind of rooted in Christian assumptions, and yet I think that the question remains open that once you have generations that grow up that are not familiar with, not just with the practice of going to church, but with, I think, just as importantly, the kind of the basic biblical stories that have structured the way that people think for centuries and centuries in this country, in other Western countries. You are kind of depriving the roots of their fertilizer. And so the question becomes, what happens to the blooms? And I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, it's an open question, I think. I don't know whether Nietzsche is going to be proved right or not. But I think that you can see the way in which, deprived of certain Christian orthodoxies and certain fundamental Christian narratives, this inheritance of kind of Christian assumptions are starting to go off in what a traditional Christian might regard as slightly heretical directions.
Mm-hmm. So one of your chapters in Dominion is entitled Woke, and so it seems to me like some of the convulsions in the West, you would say, are testimony to this revolutionary spirit that traces its roots back to Christianity. Is that now that we've had an extra year since the hardback came out? Is that still your sort of contention?
Yes, I think that the word woke is a riff on the idea, obviously, on being awakened, and the idea that people fall asleep, that they fall into sin, basically, and therefore need to be woken up from that, and to wake up to the light, to the truth, to liberate themselves from the chains of oppression, is fundamental to the history of Anglo-American Protestantism. There are, cycles of what are called awakenings that ripple through Protestant Britain and Protestant America, and this summons is something that seems to happen kind of, every few generations, and I think it's clear that the civil rights movement was absolutely part of that. That was part of this cycle of awakenings, and it's why it had such an impact in Britain, because it's part of the cultural DNA. Having said that, I think that one of the things that's been striking about Black Lives Matter and the way that it's kind of erupted over the course of this summer is that, on the one hand, the Christian dynamics are absolutely evident. Most fundamentally, there is the deep-rooted assumption that those who suffer oppression should be freed, should be liberated. And the narratives that underlie that, most obviously, are the Exodus narrative and the narrative of Christ rising from death and casting off the chains of death. And those were the stories that inspired and motivated Martin Luther King, for instance. And you can see them that they're still fundamental. The influence of those stories remains absolutely manifest. That's why people went out on the streets, because they felt that these were simply true. And again, why did the death of an innocent man put to death by the apparatus of a kind of imperial power have such an impact? Why did somebody crying out, "I can't breathe," have this impact? Well, at the heart of Western civilization, for centuries and centuries and centuries, has existed the figure of someone suffering an unjust death, dying because he couldn't breathe. So the ripples that are set out from these are very, very profound. The difference, though, between this and the civil rights movement is that this has not been overtly Christian, and it, indeed, in many cases, has been kind of antithetical to Christianity. Has seen Christianity as a kind of part of white oppression, and so that means that the relationship of the assumptions that govern Black Lives Matter, although they're deeply rooted in kind of a Christian seedbed, are not necessarily anchored in them. And the consequences of that, for instance, I think that one of the very profound shifts since the 60s has been a reaction against the doctrine of original sin. And in the 60s, the idea that we are all born with sin was seen as a kind of repellent. And so we've in a sense become Pelagian, or Augustine's doctrine of original sin. He formulated in the context of a disagreement with a British theologian called Pelagius, who argued that we can become perfect through our own efforts, that it is possible to become perfectly virtuous. And I think that there is a sense in which, in its more radical manifestations, those who condemn sin in others are reluctant to contemplate that they too may share in sin. There is a kind of Pelagian sense that it is possible to become virtuous, completely virtuous. And in a way, I think that the doctrine of original sin stands as revealed as something that is profoundly democratic. Because if we're all sinners, then we're all at fault, and you can tell other people, to take the beam out of their eye, but you should be aware of the fact that you have a mote in your eye as well. And if you don't have that, then you feel all the more qualified to sit in judgment on those who you feel have failed to kind of emancipate themselves from sin. And in a way, you then become the anti-theist stereotype of a kind of persecuting, judgmental person who refuses to accept that the person you're sitting in judgment with, that you are bred of the common stock of humanity. We're all, in that sense, in Augustinian terms, we all share in the same sin. We all share in the same fall.
Right.
So that does seem to me one of the really, really significant changes since the 60s is that a lot of the kind of virtue spirals that have happened since the 60s, they're rooted in deeply Christian assumptions, but because they've cast off the Christian doctrine of original sin, the risk is of a kind of judgmentalism and arrogance, I think.
And I guess those shackles sort of began to be thrown off in the Enlightenment. You had, Rousseau, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains, and therefore the result is I need to release this spark of liberty within me and disrupt the structures that are out there that are holding me. But that is kind of almost the photo-negative of original sin, really. And we're dealing with the fallout of that. Yeah. Let me read out. So in Dominion, you talk about the Declaration of Independence, And what a wonderful statement of human rights and equality. You say that all men had been created equal and endowed with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm glad you corrected them. It's not unalienable. You're right, Tom. It's inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were not remotely self-evident truths. That most Americans believed they were owed less to philosophy than to the Bible, to the assurance given equally to Christians and Jews, to Protestants and Catholics, to Calvinists and Quakers, that every human being was created in God's image. The truest and ultimate seedbed of the American Republic, no matter what some of those who had composed its founding documents might have cared to think, was the book of Genesis. And to that I ask, really, what about the Stoics? What about deists who were sort of founders of the American Republic, who would not perhaps would claim not to be going back to Genesis, but would be drawing on more sort of classical sources for their belief in human rights and equality? What would you say to that?
They're wrong. I mean, there was no concept of human rights in Greece or Rome.
But that's the birthplace of democracy, Tom.
Right. So this is a kind of perfect illustration of the way in which, when we look back at the classical world, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write Dominion. What you see, what you look at, is viewed through a kind of smokescreen, and the particles that constitute that smokescreen are Christian. So it's incredibly difficult, I think, to kind of brush away that smokescreen, often because we don't even realise that the smokescreen is there. We don't even realise that what you're seeing is something that's kind of distorted. So democracy, clearly it's a Greek word, power of the demos, which we might translate as the people. And so we're tempted to think that something called democracy is there in ancient Greece that our modern democracies then pick up. And our idea of democracy, which is expressed, even though the founding fathers, of course, founding a republic rather than specifically a democracy, but when they assume that there are things called rights and that everyone shares in them. And they're saying this even though notoriously women don't have the vote and black people are allowed to remain slaves under this constitution. And this is something that, and this is a kind of great source of tension and stress that ultimately will lead to the American Republic tearing itself apart and collapsing into civil war. And it takes a very, very long time for these ideals, these democratic ideals, to be fulfilled. Many would argue that they still haven't been fulfilled properly to this day. But the idea that a democracy is an expression of a kind of ideological notion of the rights of each individual is very, very deeply rooted. And so when we look back at ancient Athens, the criticism, it's the point that is almost invariably made is, well, it was a democracy for the Athenian men. Women didn't have the vote. There were slaves, metics, foreigners didn't have the vote. Which is entirely to see it through Christian glasses, Christian lenses, because that is not what democracy was to the Athenians. The Athenians were not saying that this is that our way of government is an ideological one, rooted in abstract values, abstract notions of rights, of individual rights. What the power of the demos expressed was a highly complex, subtle, emotionally grounded sense the Athenians had that they were bred of the soil, that they were autochthonous in the Greek word, that they were literally creatures who had emerged from the earth of Attica, and that they'd done this as favourites of the gods and specifically of Athena, and that therefore the demos, the body of the Athenian people, should have power because that was what the gods, and Athena specifically, had willed. And that in this kind of nexus of the divine, the earth, and the human, everyone who was bred of this soil, everyone who was a true-born Athenian, had duties to the soil and to the gods that they had emerged from. So men, it was their responsibility to fight, to sit in the assembly, to pass laws if they were required. Women had the responsibility, above all, of liaising with the gods. So if you go to the British Museum and you look at the Parthenon friezes, you'll see that it's women who lead the Panathenaic procession up to the Acropolis. It's women, above all, who mediate between the human and the divine. And that, in the opinion of the Athenians, is just as significant and just as important, in some ways more important role, than for men sitting in the assembly casting their votes. The point is that democracy for the Athenians, demokratia, is something that is expressive of a way of seeing the world that Christianity has radically, radically dissolved. So completely dissolved it that we don't even recognise it when we see it. We think that it is about rights, about responsibility, about individual rights, that kind of thing, ideological frameworks of the kind that we might see in a modern democracy. It's nothing of the kind. But because we're so Christianised, we can't recognise what it is that we're missing. And again, that is what happens when you look back at the classical world. We're so habituated to seeing the world through Christian lenses that we don't even recognise what it is that we're doing when we do that.
Yes, yeah. We don't recognise how theological they were in what they were saying, but we also don't recognise how theological we are when we express beliefs in things like human rights.
But also you see, I mean, going back to atheism as a kind of logical endpoint of a strand of Protestant Christianity, we're tempted to look back at ancient Athens and ask, well, did the Greeks really believe this stuff? Of course they didn't. We kind of assume that nobody really believes this stuff. That they're all philosophers, they all think it's nonsense. That the very idea that the gods exist is something is kind of an irrelevance. And so we can talk about Athens. Religion could be a kind of chapter in a book on the Greeks, but by and large we then move on to more secular stuff like voting or fighting or anything, and we don't recognise that this again is a deeply, deeply Christian idea. The idea that there is a secular space and that there is something called religion which exists to one side, and that the Greek religion is so patently ridiculous with all its stories of gods that no one could possibly have believed it. This is Protestantism writ large. And the fact that most historians of ancient Greece and that most people who write about it, this is the model that they adopt. They probably don't think of themselves as Protestant historians, but that's exactly what they are. I mean, that's what I was.
Sure. I would love to go back and we'll compare and contrast sort of the Christian origins story and where we've come from according to Genesis 1 to 3, with those sorts of more classical origin stories. But just on this point, it can be very difficult to disagree with your thesis, can't it, Tom? Because in some ways, a critic of Christianity comes and they give some critique of Christianity, and your response can be, "How very Christian of you." That there is that kind of is your thesis unfalsifiable, or if not, what would falsify it?
I mean, I think that it first it requires you first of all, I think, to question your own assumptions. Like, this is why I've written the book. I was questioning my own assumptions, not allowing any, saying, where does this come from? Where does this idea come from? How saturated is it in assumptions that I haven't acknowledged? It's kind of bias training, I suppose. I think that when you do that, you're forced to acknowledge, or at least I was forced to acknowledge, that it's actually very, very, very difficult to stand outside the Christian influence, because essentially the West is Christian, in the way that the Islamic world is Muslim, the way that radioactivity lingers in the air after a radiation leak, that it's just there. It's just, you breathe it in. You can't really help it. Now, of course, there are ways to, there are very different ways of seeing the world, and what's happening in India gives you one example of that. I think what's happening in China gives you another. In our own European history, we have the example of the Nazis, who absolutely repudiated not just doctrinal Christianity, as the French revolutionaries had done, as the Russian revolutionaries had done, but some of the most fundamental tenets of Christianity, among which, we talked about the image of Christ on the cross. That is about, that is a profoundly visual statement of the notion that the slave will conquer the master, that the tortured will conquer the torturer, that the oppressed will conquer the oppressor, which the Nazis regarded as ridiculous. Everything that the Nazis were about was to reject that. And also, of course, they rejected what you were just talking about, the idea of Genesis, that all human beings are created equally. The Christian refinement in Paul that there is no Jew or Greek. The Nazis completely thought that there were differences between Jews and Greeks, and they launched genocide on the back of it. So we do have that example, and so if we want to know what an unchristian world looks like, we can, for starters, look at the Third Reich. What is it? The Nazis thought what they were doing was right. They didn't sit down and say, it's like the Mitchell and Webb sketch, are we the baddies? They didn't think they were the baddies. They thought they were the goodies. They thought what they were doing was right for the German people. The fact that we have enshrined them as, literally demonic. We don't need Satan because we've got Hitler. We don't need hell because we've got Auschwitz. We don't need devils because we've got the Nazis. But we regard them as diabolical because we bring Christian frames of reference to their ideologies. So in a sense, the shadows of the corpse of God on the wall of the cave, that's what the dread of Nazism is. The kind of the nightmare that there are Nazis lurking everywhere, waiting to take over, which is a huge part of contemporary liberal discourse, it seems to me, clearly belongs to the deep, the lengthy Christian tradition, the anxiety that that evil may triumph and that large numbers of people have given themselves up to evil. Which you see manifest in the witch craze, in the Albigensian Crusade, in all kinds of things like that. We don't dread Satan anymore because Hitler has taken on the role of Satan, but we dread Hitler for the same reason that Christians dreaded Satan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've offered a very stark alternative to standing within the Christian tradition. First of all, there's Nietzsche. Do you want to go that path? There's Hitler. Do you want to go that path? For those.
Well, of course, you see, Nietzsche wrote, when Nietzsche wrote, he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't, but he says that the death of God will basically kind of bring about terrible convulsions, deeds of great horror, and he was, he was right. The Nazis.
Absolutely.
What the Nazis did depended on their repudiation of the fundamentals of Christian doctrine, even as, of course, it also drew on elements of it, so the traditions of anti-Semitism, the apocalyptic strain of the 1,000-year Reich. There are clearly, it's even Nazism is flavoured by the inheritance of Christianity, but it is the most radical attempt to reject Christianity that Europe has seen since the time of Constantine.
And that notwithstanding the horrible errors of the church in not repudiating Nazism sufficiently, in not excommunicating Nazi leaders, in in some ways going along with the Third Reich. You would say, notwithstanding those inconsistencies, that Christianity. What are you pointing to at that point? What is it that is standing against Christianity, standing against Nazism? Because Christians in history collaborated with all sorts of evil all down through the ages. What are you boiling down to the kernel of truth that you identify as this is what Christianity is that actually opposes Nazism?
Well, I think that there are two kind of pretty non-negotiable values, which are the ones that I said. The idea that we're all created equal, and the idea that the first shall be last, the last shall be first. That Christ comes not as a conqueror, but as a man nailed to a cross.
Right.
And those are kind of two doctrines which remain fundamental to Western liberalism.
Right.
I mean, where do they come from? They don't just magically appear. And I think that Western liberalism is profoundly shaped by, it's kind of like the mirror image of what the Nazis did. But why do we find what the Nazis did so terrible?
Right.
Because we are instinctively Christian.
Yeah. And in the book and in the passage that I read out, you trace back the Declaration of Independence and this Declaration of human equality back to Genesis. What in particular are you thinking of from Genesis?
Man, and obviously there are two different kind of stories that have been bundled up together in the Genesis narrative. One of which the role of women is considerably inferior to that of men, but in the other, men and women are equally created in the image of God, and that gives to human beings an incredible dignity. If there is one God who has fashioned the entire cosmos, and that God has created human beings in his image, then the dignity that accrues to that is common to all human beings.
Right. And in the literature of the ancient Near East, the king might be said to be in the image of God, but suddenly you've got humanity, male and female. Yeah. Male and female.
I mean, there's as everyone knows, that there are all kinds of echoes of the Genesis narrative in Mesopotamian myth, in particular, Canaanite myth, but in the Babylonian account of the crucifixion, humans are created quite specifically to serve as slaves to the gods. The gods get tired of building temples, so they create humans to build the temples to them. That's not the role that humans have in the Genesis account. Humans are not created to be slaves. Humans are created to live in the image of God.
Right. It's very temple-like language throughout the Garden of Eden, and humanity has this sort of priestly role to work it and keep it, and that they are placed in God's most favored place, and therefore, emphatically not slaves in that way. Are there other things we can learn from Genesis chapters 1 to 3? Do you think, as you think back to those origin stories?
Well, one of the factors, one of the consequences of the Genesis story that has always intrigued me and led to the first kind of glimmerings of doubt that I had as a child is, of course, the way that it contradicts what we now know is the prehistory of this planet. That this is not what happened. I mean, it may have a kind of quality of the truth of myth, but there's no place for the Precambrian explosion or trilobites or dinosaurs or in Genesis. And that was always an issue for me because I was obsessed by prehistory, and I would have large numbers of books which showed the sweep of life on Earth, and then I'd have illustrated Bibles, and the challenge of matching them up, was kind of difficult for me. But what I now recognise is that we would not have those books detailing the immensity of geological time and the growth of life over the millions and millions of years if it weren't for Genesis, I think. Because what Genesis gives us is a sense that the world has a beginning and that time flows from that point forwards. And in the Christian Bible, Genesis is one bookend, Revelation is the other. So people who read the Christian Bible from cover to cover leave it with a sense that time moves in a single direction, that there is a beginning, Genesis, and that there is an end point that will come. And that in turn gives us a structure of time, time's arrow. And again, this comes to saturate the assumptions of people in the West so thoroughly that they don't even think of it as being something, just take it for granted. Even though in other cultures, in other civilizations, in other philosophies, the idea that time is a cycle, that it goes round and round and round, that there are cycles of creation and destruction, is very powerful. But if you have that sense that time is going round in a cycle, it's hard to make sense of, say, fossils in sedimentary rock. In a sense, to make sense of what the layers of sediment might tell us, the antiquity of rocks, what bones of giant monsters dug up out of quarries might reveal about the past, you need a sense of time, which certainly in Europe has been given to us by Genesis and by the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Which helps us not just with the scientific method, but I guess it helps us with all those rights and equality issues that we're speaking about. And we mentioned that, Martin Luther King Jr., that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice as well, is another, I guess, inheritance of that kind of Hebrew vision, do you think?
Well, yeah, but the Hebrew, yes, I mean, but of course what the Old Testament completely teaches is that things go horribly wrong, and that there are horrible smash ups. But yes, the idea that ultimately there is a divine plan and that all shall be well is there too, and that's been the great, that's been the reassurance that the Bible provides, is that no matter how terrible things are, God is good and God is all-powerful, and therefore ultimately things will be good. Yeah. But that is obviously requires a certain leap of faith. And so I think a lot of liberal agony at the moment is that, since the end of the Cold War, there has been a kind of assumption that history's come to an end, that things can only get better. And in the absence of religious faith, there have been all kinds of sociological or philosophical attempts to construct reasons for believing in that. But I think that now in 2020, those attempts look pretty threadbare. It becomes evident that actually there isn't some law woven into the fabric of human society that means that things will necessarily bend in a liberal direction. Things go horribly wrong. So ultimately, to believe that things will be all right again kind of requires a leap of faith. And again, this is kind of where what I kind of realized is that things that I had taken for granted were actually beliefs. Right. And require a leap of faith to believe in them. And to that extent, they remain Christian assumptions.
Right. And speaking as a Christian minister, I would say it kind of requires you to look at that victim on the cross and to believe that he is the victor, to believe that somehow that is the path, and that somehow ultimate reality works out, because the arc of history, we tend to think of the arc going that way. Actually, the arc goes down into the valley of shadow.
Well, yes, and so when I was writing,
that it would come up.
I can't remember whether I talked about this the previous time we spoke, but when I was when I was writing this, I went to a Yazidi town in northern Iraq that had just been liberated from the Islamic State, and people had been crucified there, and the people who'd done those crucifixions were a couple of miles away, within striking distance, and I remembered standing there in this place where people had suffered crucifixion and knowing that the people who'd done it were, absolutely on the doorstep, and feeling this great abyss of kind of existential terror, not just at the thought that men who could inflict such cruelties were as close as they were, but a kind of broader terror at the idea of a world in which the cross did not signify what it signifies for me and for most people who are brought up in a Western country. You don't have to be a believing Christian to kind of subliminally have a sense that the cross is a good thing. That if you're lying injured and somebody turns up with a red cross on their uniform, that this is going to be good. And to think that actually that might all be delusion, that the cross might actually represent what it represented to the Romans, namely the right and the power of the powerful to torture to death those who are less powerful than them, was a kind of, it opened up a really terrifying existential abyss in front of me, which is why when I went back, I rewrote the opening of Dominion to talk about the crucifixion, and it's why at the very end of the book I talk about that experience, because I think that humanity can't bear too much reality, and I think that for us in the West, we don't want to think that maybe the torturer will win. And a huge part, again, to go back to Black Lives Matter, I mean that is the great convulsive expression of that. It's a kind of a group. It's a communal expression of horror at the idea that the torturer might win, that the slaver might win, that that those who grind down the oppressed are history's victors. And why do people think that? Where does that even come from, if not from Christianity?
Yeah.
And you see that, you see that manifest not just in what happened to the Yazidis, but in what's happening in China at the moment. 1 million people being targeted.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and so what do we do with our minorities? What do we do with the least and the last and the lost and the weak? We exclude them. We extinguish them. Christianity is just so unique in valorizing the victim, seeing him raised up, so that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Right. Yeah. It's Christ or the pit, Tom, isn't it? It's Christ or the pit.
No, because there are, there are. Roman civilization was not just about torturing people to death. I mean, it was certainly a feature of it. But people lived and laughed and loved and so that's not the totality of it. But I wouldn't want to live in a world without that assurance.
And therefore, there is that kind of leap of faith. I know we spoke back in November, and I said there are lots of Christians praying for you, Tom, and you said keep the prayers coming. So in the last year or so, where do you find yourself as you consider that one on the cross? Do you think of that as a kind of a dead end in terms of the end of a story? You're in the valley of the shadow, and that's that. Or do you think he might be a doorway through to hope and peace and joy?
I think that well, I've said that I've realised that all my the kind of the liberal assumptions I had float on faith, that without faith they have no they have no validity. So essentially, I have lost my faith as as a liberal. I've lost my faith. I don't really believe in it, but in my gut I still do. I have no objective reason for thinking that anything that I thought as a liberal is true. I don't believe that human rights objectively exist or anything like that. I don't objectively think that there's anything in the arc of history that suggests that the strong won't crush the weak, that powerful states won't enslave parts of the population that they want to enslave. I mean, all of these things, just... And so does that open up a kind of existential abyss? Kind of, but what it also does, and I'm speaking entirely for myself here, is that because I now understand where my beliefs and values came from, that rather than just drown completely beneath a kind of despair, I can cling to stories. And I think that ultimately the power of Christianity is expressed most potently through its stories. And those stories are not just in the New Testament, but in what Christians call the Old Testament as well. And those stories don't have to be literally true. So the Exodus doesn't have to be literally true for the story itself, in my opinion, to be true. So I think that certain stories have such a power that you can surrender to them. And so essentially that's what I feel that I'm doing, is that I've surrendered to the truth of the stories, and therefore of the kind of the poetry and the mythology that they express. And I'm happy to identify myself with the truth of those stories and to see them as true in a kind of a moral, a poetic, a mythical sense. And I realised that the whole issue of whether I think they, are they literally true? Did Moses literally part the Red Sea? I've just decided I'm not worrying about that. Because I think the power of those stories is sufficiently great that I can say, well, I'm going to believe in them.
Yeah.
And
I think that's the path. Yeah.
And what I've kind of felt after 4 years of fairly intensive immersion in Christian writings and studying Christian lives is that essentially the beliefs that I hold as a liberal are when I try to think, well, what the roots are, they seem anemic and uninteresting compared to the interest and the kind of the potency of the Christian mythography that gave birth to them. And I'd really rather have the poetry and the power and the myth than the kind of the pallid simulacrum, which is basically what I think I previously had.
Very well put.
However,
Yes,
I mean, against that, I think that, and again, I speak entirely personally here, and I'm sure that this is my own fault. I haven't looked hard enough, but I felt that over the course of this year, the churches have been a letdown. I think that the experience of pandemic, it sets you to asking, why is this happening? It raises profound issues of theodicy. And there was one moment where I felt that a kind of answer was being given. And it wasn't an explicit answer. It wasn't a kind of theological attempt to explain why do bad things happen or anything like that. But it was when the Pope held an open-air mass in St. Peter's Square, and he was socially distanced, so it was just him. In the background, you had the bells of Rome clanging out, and you had the wail of sirens dealing with the pandemic. And he prayed before an icon that had been sent from Constantinople to Gregory the Great. And Gregory the Great is in my book. And Gregory became Pope at a time of plague. And he led processions and he prayed, and the plague came to an end. And Gregory, in turn, had written a commentary on the book of Job. And Job, of course, is the Bible's most unsettling and profound attempt to answer the question that everyone who's going through the pandemic is asking now. And I felt watching that on a kind of live stream that we were going through things that previous generations had gone through, and that in a sense the line that reached back from the Pope in that square through the experience of plague in Gregory's Rome, back to the writing of Job and the kind of horrors of the world in which that book was written, that it was all kind of part of a continuum, and that if there was a God, then that was a kind of expression of the answers that were being given. And it felt incredibly profound and comforting and unsettling in all kinds of ways that weren't to be found on government health lines or accounts about what we should do to stay healthy, or how we should even help others or anything like that. That it was kind of cutting directly to the heart of what it is to be human in a world where these awful things happen, and situating them in this vast cultural inheritance of attempts to explain it in a certain way, and that we were therefore part of this continuum, and there was a kind of comfort there that people had been there before us. Now, so I had that experience, and I waited for more, and I didn't get them, and I felt that the response of the churches was a kind of a pallid echo of public health announcements, and of course, terribly important for bishops and vicars and so on to give public health announcements, but I that's what public health officials are for. I kind of feel the churches are there to give answers and to situate what's happening in the context of this kind of weird shit that they're teaching. And I haven't felt that I haven't.
What would that look like, though? What would that look like in any? I mean, obviously the Pope in Rome can do that great theatre, that great drama. What would it look like in, for instance, an English setting or an Anglican setting? Goodness,
I think that it might be expressed through open air services like the Pope did.
Yes.
That an attempt to root what's happening in the cultural and the scriptural inheritance of what's gone before. I mean, I haven't heard I've heard almost nothing about why this is happening, about what the story, what does the Bible say about plagues? There are an awful lot of plagues in the Bible, and there's an awful lot of attempts by Christians to understand why plagues happen and what people should do in plagues, and this seems to me an incredibly valuable resource, and something I'd much rather hear a bishop talk about that than kind of tell me to wash my hands. I mean, I know that washing hands is important, but I don't want to hear it from people who I would want to hear more from. I mean, they may have been doing this, and also, I mean, I had this odd kind of during the lockdown. I read the Canterbury Tales. And the great opening to the Canterbury Tales, when Chaucer goes to a pub in April and he meets with all kinds of different people and he doesn't socially distance, and he heads off on pilgrimage to Canterbury to the shrine of St. Thomas, who heals the sick. And I've read it loads and loads of times before, and this time round it moved me and struck me in ways that it had never done before, because I suddenly realised that, of course, when Chaucer was writing that, plague was endemic in London, and much worse during the winter months, as we're finding out now. You kind of, when plague is endemic, you dread the winter, and then when April comes, suddenly plague retreats, and you can start meeting strangers in pubs again, and then you go out. The joy of heading out, going to a shrine where God's power to cure and heal is manifest, in a miraculous way. And it kind of inspired me to set off on a pilgrimage. So I'm midway through a pilgrimage to Canterbury. I'm not going there because I think that, the shrine of St. Thomas is gone, and Canterbury is now an Anglican cathedral, Protestant cathedral. So the idea that you pray to saints for miracles is obviously not part of the fabric. But I think the kind of the impulse to, and I'm really only thinking of this now, to kind of take a route along a route that other people have taken, to feel that you share in the experiences of people who have gone through something similar and who have explained it in a certain way, and to do as they have done, and to see whether you can find a source of comfort in the way that they did, I've found very powerful. And I think that's something, that sense of communion with people in the past is something that Christianity, perhaps better than any other framework for making sense of what's going on, provides. Because it does, it goes back before Christianity. That thread goes all the way back to the experience in the Hebrew Scriptures of plague. It's this vast kind of continuum, this consolation, this resource. And I didn't get the feeling that I think that is something that the churches could provide, or could draw attention to, or could structure, and haven't done. But then I maybe they have been and I've missed it. I mean, I'm aware that it's kind of all slipped. I've been too busy living in the classical world and playing cricket all summer to have.
Sounds nice. You haven't been engaging with church politics, but you have been playing cricket. Dear me.
Yeah, on the Sabbath too.
Yeah. Well, these are prophetic words to finish with, Tom, and I do take them to heart, and hope that many more Christians do. I've taken up so much of your time. You've been very generous with it, but I do hope that people will go out and get Dominion, the making of the Western mind, and put the thesis to the test. Figure out where this inheritance has come from, and trace it back to its roots. I think you do a terrific job, Tom, and just personally as a Christian, my heart was warmed, especially as you speak of the cross, and I think seeing the cross at the heart of all things, including human history, has done my faith a world of good. So I know that wasn't the intention to have Anglican ministers be warmed in the cockles of their heart, but it certainly has helped me, and I recommend it heartily to many people. But Tom Holland, thank you so much for joining us on Reset.
Thanks very much for having me.